Okay. Good morning. Hello, everybody. It's bright and early here in Eretz Yisrael. It's 6 o'clock in the morning, and we're together today to walk through the Psalms. My name is Penina Taylor, in case you didn't know, and I'd like to thank you for joining us on this amazing journey that we're about to embark on. I think it's going to transform our experience with Tehillim, with the Psalms, and probably change our lives forever. So first, I'm going to start with just a few housekeeping items here. First of all, it's not too late for other people to join us, okay? So if you really get a tremendous amount out of the class and you know somebody that you think would also enjoy it and you think that they'd like to participate, please tell them about it and let them know that they can still register. They can go to www.peninataylor.com. You know, it's funny, nowadays you don't have to say the W's, but I've always been in the habit of saying them, and so old habits die hard. But anyway, go to peninataylor.com, click on events, click on walk through the Psalms, and they can still register for the class, and they'll have access to all of the recordings from previous classes, so they won't have to miss anything. They can go through them in the right order if they want, although to be truthful, it really doesn't matter what order you watch them in. So again, it's not too late for somebody to join the class, so please let your friends know. Please share the link on Facebook if you don't mind. And also, you should know that not every class is going to be exactly 1 hour. I will keep them all under an hour because there are some people who are getting ready to go to bed. There are some people who will be watching on their lunch hour. And so I'll be aiming to keep it at just under an hour, but it may be 50 minutes. It's all going to depend on what subject, obviously, we're going to be working on that day. And not every class is going to be one psalm by itself. Today we have some introduction, and the first psalm is very short, so we will be covering the whole thing, but other times we may only be covering a part of it, because as you'll see in a few minutes during the introduction, some of the Psalms or Tehillim are rather short, like Psalm 117 that only has 2 verses, and others are somewhat long. So after 5 weeks, after week 5, you will receive an email with instructions on how to pay for the next coming month. Now, I'm not holding anybody to any major obligations. You're free to quit at any time that you want, but I do ask that everybody make a commitment for 1 full month at a time. As you've probably noticed, the amount that I'm charging to do this webinar is rather low for somebody who's doing a webinar, and that's because I care more about getting the content across and about my students than necessarily about the income. Maybe I should care about the income more, but I believe that you get what you want in life by helping others get what they want in life. And so if you really enjoy it and you feel that you're getting more value out of it, talk to me. I'd be more than happy to take a larger donation. But anyway, so I'm asking, because of that everybody commit to 1 month at a time. So at the beginning of the month, you'll pay for the month. If you don't want to do it anymore, that's fine. You'll have access to all of the recordings for the month, but I'm asking that everybody do that. So, okay, this is very important. One last thing. Since there are all types of people who will be joining my class, Jewish and non-Jewish, people new to studying, and people far more learned than I am, I will usually be using the English terminology for things. And when I do use the Hebrew, I will be sure to translate it as well, at least the first time I use it. Okay? So then let's get on with class. It's said in the Midrash that Moshe, gave Israel the 5 books of the Torah, and David gave Israel the 5 books of Tehillim, or the Psalms. Whether by accident or on purpose, the fact that Tehillim is also structured in 5 books seems to give it a bond that far surpasses the apparent coincidence of the structure of the 2 books. David wrote Tehillim from a place of deep and continuous awareness of God's presence as creator of all that exists. It was this awareness of God's presence in every moment of our lives that's made Tehillim the essential companion to the Torah. So the Tehillim, or the Psalms, are so much more than just a collection of writings. To the Jewish people, Tehillim has served as an anchor to prayer, a comfort in challenging times. What Moshe and the Torah gave to our minds, David and the Tehillim gave to our hearts. It says in the Gemara, said the Holy One, blessed be he, to David, one day of your Torah means more to me than 1,000 offerings that Solomon is destined to bring to my altar. And that can be found in the Gemara in Shabbat 30b and in Makot 10a. Now, the sages ask the question, wait a minute. David's Torah? What does that mean, David's Torah? What's David's Torah? David didn't write a Torah. Moshe wrote a Torah. What does it mean, David's Torah? David's Torah is the Tehillim. It's the Psalms. And so what God is saying here is that the prayers that the Jewish people would be praying using David's Torah, David's Psalms, are more precious to God than any offering. And we'll see in just a minute that indeed the scriptures seem to indicate that prayer is more precious to God even than the sacrifices. Now, it's said that prayer is made up of 4 parts: praise or tehillah, repentance or teshuvah, gratitude or todah, and requests or supplications, techina. You see what I did there with the T, right? Tehillah, teshuvah, todah, and techina. We see the Tehillim embodying all 4 elements of prayer. And so they've become the foundation for Jewish prayer. And of course, as I started to say a minute ago, the Jewish scriptures are replete with references to God wanting our prayers more than sacrifices. And in fact, prayers are equated with sacrifices in the Tanakh for their atoning effect. There are literally dozens of examples, but I'm only going to share with you 3 today. Now, I know that on some of your screens, my picture may be blocking some of the words. I know that happens in the recording. I apologize for that. The first one comes from the Tehillim, Psalm 141, verse 2, and it says, may my prayer be counted as incense before you, the lifting up of my hands as the evening offering. Then it says in Mishlei, or Proverbs, chapter 15, verse 8, take words with you and return to the Lord. Say to him, carry away all iniquity and receive us graciously, that we may offer the calves of our lips. And it's interesting that the word there that's calves, sometimes in some translations it's translated as fruit. The word is parim. Parim are calves, literally. Even if it was parot, which would be fruit, it would still mean the same thing, but I think it's much more meaningful that the word is parim. It's calves. What does that mean? We may offer the calves of our lips. And I think taken in the context of these other verses, we see that the prayers are not only more important to God than the offerings, but can serve as a substitute. Now, in my class on atonement and righteousness, one of the things that I talk about is the fact that the sacrifices actually don't serve the purpose that everybody thinks they serve. And what has always accomplished atonement, even when we had a temple and blood sacrifices, what accomplished the atonement was the repentance and the prayer. Prayer has always been an essential part of what it means to be a Jewish person. And so the Tehillim have been part of that and part of the Jewish people, well, actually, as you'll see in a minute, since before David. Now, although the word Tehillim is plural, many Tehillahs, and a Tehillah is a praise or a glory, we don't refer to one of the Tehillim as a Tehillah, but rather as a Mizmor. The word Mizmor means a hymn or a song. That's H-Y-M-N, a hymn or a song. So that's why we use the word psalm. It's a literal translation. Now, Mizmor Aleph, Psalm 1, starts off with a really interesting phrase, and I'll show you in a few minutes, but it starts off with the words Ashrei Ha'ish. These are the praises of a man. Now, some of the English translations translate the phrase Ashrei Ha'ish as praiseworthy is the man. The literal translation is the praises of a man. Okay, Ashrei is a plural word. Now, that's the beginning of Psalms. That's the first one. That's what Mizmor Aleph starts with. And the Torah ends with the phrase, Ashrecha Yisrael mi kamocha. Your praises, Israel, who can compare? Now, the vast majority of the Torah concentrates on what we call in Judaism as the klal, the nation as a whole. Although there are certainly instructions referring to the individual as well, for sure, it seems like David purposely chose to shift the focus from the national relationship with God to the individual relationship with God. So now, many people throughout the generations have asked the question, are the Jewish people, is Judaism a race or is it a religion? And the answer is yes. You see, in what is often referred to as Greek thought, things are black and white. If something is true, then its opposite must necessarily be false. Now that's logic, right? Two seemingly opposite things cannot both be true. But in Hebraic thought, two opposite things can both simultaneously be true or right. For example, the classic question in Judaism of whether we should be lighting the Hanukkah candles, increasing in number each night or decreasing in number each night. There's also the question of of which direction to light them. In Greek thinking, only one of those could be correct. But in Judaism, they are both correct, depending on which set of traditions you personally are bound to. In similar fashion, the Jewish people have two completely separate frameworks for their relationship with God. And this can be seen in the fact that in the Tanakh, we're referred to in both the plural and in the singular sometimes. And sometimes it happens in one sentence. How can this be? This is because the Jewish people have both a national relationship with God and an individual relationship with God. Where else do we see evidence of this? In the book of Bereshit, or Genesis, after Abraham passes the test of his willingness to offer his son Isaac to God, God gives him a blessing. In chapter 22, verses 17 through 18, God says to Abraham, "Indeed, I will greatly bless you. I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you obeyed my voice." In this passage, God describes the future descendants of Abraham as being both like the stars of the heavens and the sand on the seashore. Both are uncountably numerous, but they have very different characteristics. Think about the stars in the sky. If you go out to a place that's very, very dark at night and you manage to isolate one star, it's pretty small to the naked eye, but it still has a beauty of its own. It twinkles. It might have a color. A single star shines very brightly. A single star can serve as a guide for navigation. But put that star in a blanket of stars in the sky, and it disappears. That is the beauty of the individual. But take a single grain of sand, and what do you have? Nothing really, right? One single grain of sand in your shoe, you may not even notice, probably won't notice. What can you do with a single grain of sand? Nothing. Not that I know of. But take that grain of sand and add it to a million other grains of sand, and now you have something you can do with it. You can make a timer, you can make art, but even better than that, subject it, and it's funny because subject it to tremendous heat, right? That doesn't sound very good, but when you do that, what do you get? You get glass. The discovery and development of glass is probably the one most revolutionary thing to be developed in the past 2,000 years. You might want to name, electricity and other things, but think about where our technology would be with all the technology that we now possess. How much of it would actually be possible if we didn't have glass? Think about it. How much glass is involved in the process of us doing this webinar right now? We have the glass in our webcams and on our monitors, and I'm wearing glasses so that I can see you and the screen. The invention of glass helped mankind in tremendous ways. Think about it. When they first made the telescope, they were able to discover things in space that they never thought even existed until the invention of windows. And I don't mean windows on the computer, I mean real windows. People in many parts of the world had to live in nearly complete darkness for 1/3 to 1/2 of the year. They couldn't have light without the weather coming in. But glass windows allowed them to have light even when it was cold, raining, or snowing outside. Glasses allowed for a very large percentage of the human race to be able to see and read. And of course, we know that microscopes allowed us to discover a whole world that until that point had been completely unseen. Not only atoms, but we learned about germs, bacteria, and viruses, and different things like that. Glass revolutionized the world. This tiny little insignificant grain of sand, this piece of nothing, combined with millions of other insignificant nothings and exposed to heat, changed the world. The same is true of the Jewish people. In one respect, we are nothing, but when we come together as a whole, as a nation, we can and do change the world. And this is why God gave us two separate frameworks for our relationship with Him. We as people, as individuals, we have an individual relationship with God. Everyone on earth also has that individual relationship with God, Jew and non-Jew. All the same in that regard. And in that framework, we're responsible for our own individual sins, and we bear the consequences of our choices. But then the Jewish people as a whole, we say in Hebrew, the klal, we have a national relationship with God that is unique among the nations. And the state of the nation's relationship with God determines the consequences that we face as a people. We have a unique covenant and relationship with God as His bride, which is alluded to in many of the prophets. God refers to Israel as His bride. And whether we fare well or not as a nation is at least partly dependent on what that relationship looks like. That's why we have Yom Kippur, for example. Every day, each individual is responsible for their relationship with God and for doing teshuvah. You are responsible today for your relationship with God, whether or not you're going to have a relationship with Him, and whether or not you're going, and whether or not you're going to do teshuvah today for repenting and repairing their relationship with God. But as a nation, our forgiveness, indeed our fate as a nation, is determined on that one day. Yes, there are also an individual aspect to the day of Yom Kippur, because it's still a whole. The whole, W-H-O-L-E, whole, is still made up of many individual parts, but we're also part of that whole. So here we are, we come to the first Mizmor of David, and he starts by moving us from the national framework of the Torah to the individual framework of the Tehillim, the praises of man. Now, before we actually launch into Mizmor Aleph, just a little information about the book of Tehillim. The book of Tehillim is made up of 150 chapters, or 150 individual psalms. Some have as few as 2 verses, some as such as 117, all the way up to 176 verses in Psalm 119. Most of the Tehillim was composed by King David, and 73 of them are specifically labeled with his name. 13 of those relate explicitly to events that happened in the king's life. Now, 12 are attributed to Asaph, 11 to the sons of Korach, and 2 to Solomon. That, of course, leaves 52 without any reference to authorship. Apparently, there's a reference in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I can give you the number if you're really interested, which attributes more than 3,600 Tehillim to King David. So apparently he wrote a whole lot more than what he actually put in the final compilation of what he was giving to hand down to the rest of us. The Talmud actually lists 10 authors in addition to King David. It says in Bava Batra 14b, David composed the book of Psalms through 10 elders: Adam, Melchizedek, Abraham, Moses, Haman, not Haman as in the Haman of Purim, somebody else, Yedutun, Asaph, and the 3 sons of Korach. According to Midrash, Jacob recited Psalms during his 20-year stay in Lavan's home. So according to our tradition, at least some of the Psalms were composed and recited many generations before King David lived. So how is it then that for the most part, the Psalms are attributed to King David? I mean, yes, he did write the majority of them, but generally speaking, if you Googled right now who wrote the Psalms, the answer that would come up on Rabbi Google would be King David. David alone is given credit for having written them, even though he was not the sole author. And the reason is the Talmud relates that while others said the words of Psalms, David alone gave them expression and life. Now, you should also know that the Tehillim are not arranged in any chronological sequence. One other note about numbers and chapters and numbering. Until the early 13th century, none of the books in the Tanakh had chapter numbers. And it wasn't until the mid-16th century that the chapters contained verse numbers. Apparently, there was one early edition of the Bible, I think made in the 9th century, which did have chapter divisions. But given the late development of chapter and verse divisions, the fact that the Hebrew already had a form of division embedded in the punctuation, it makes sense that the Christian versions of the Bible and the Jewish scriptures might not always line up. You see, up until that time in the 13th century, the Jewish Bibles were divided by what we call parshiot, by chapters and subjects, but it wasn't numbered. They were named. And the Torah itself is marked at the beginning and the ends of paragraphs by certain special letters that are written into the Torah. Why did we adopt a numbering system besides the fact that it makes sense because it makes it a whole lot easier to reference the Bible? The reason is exactly that. In the early 1200s, we had something called the disputations. Ramban, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, Moshe ben Nachman, or Nachmanides, was subjected to a series of debates that he did not have the option of engaging or not engaging in, public debates between the Christian leadership in Spain and him as the chief rabbi. And so what happened was that these Christian scholars would make reference to a particular passage, and because we didn't have the same numbering system, he not specifically the Ramban, but we had no way of answering these questions that were being forced upon us because we couldn't reference our Bible the same way. And so in the early 13th century, the Jewish community did adopt the Christian numbering system of the Bible. However, like I said, because we already had a system of division, at least where things were to begin and end because of the punctuation, sometimes the verse numbers don't exactly line up between the Jewish translations of the Bible and the English or Christian translations. So most of the time they do. And when they don't, they're most often just one or two verses off. But this is relevant to our study of Tehillim because sometimes they don't always align exactly. And in this course, we will be following the Jewish numbering system, but where there's a difference, I'll note it so that you know, okay? All of the Mizmarim convey an emotional awareness of Hashem's involvement in every aspect of our lives. That attitude pervades Tehillim, whether the composer is experiencing joy or sadness, pain or pleasure. And that's an important point. It's comparatively easy to feel positive towards God when times are good. After all, we owe everything to Him, right? It's much more challenging to value the relationship when one is being challenged or when tragedy strikes for some unexplained reason. David teaches us that hard lesson because the truth be told, his entire life was filled with challenges. He had every reason to feel resentment for finding himself a hunted fugitive after being promised the glory of royalty. Yet he accepted the will of Hashem with humility and love. This is what the beautiful poetry of Tehillim, or the Psalms, teaches us. Now, we have a practice in our home on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, at the third Shabbat meal, which is usually eaten about an hour before Shabbat is about to end. We ask everybody to share what we call a story of Hashgacha Pratit. The word Hashgacha Pratit means divine intervention. Now, we always try to prepare our guests ahead of time, don't worry, so that they know that at Sudat Shlishi, we're going to ask everybody at the table, or at least everyone who is willing, to share a story of Hashgacha Pratit at the meal. We give them plenty of warning so that they can be thinking about it during the course of the day. Hashgacha Pratit literally means, like I said, divine intervention. So people come to our table and share stories of how they have seen God's hand in their lives. Now, this is a very important practice because unlike our spouse, who we can see, we can hear, we can touch, we can feel, God is incorporeal and usually invisible, but not always. You see, not if you're looking for Him. And that's the point. I believe that the reason that God created a system of families and communities and society is to teach us how to relate to Him, which can be a very hard thing for some of us. But if you know that somebody is going to be asking you to share a story of divine intervention when you come to the table, you begin to keep your eyes open for it. And in fact, people who come back to our table again and again, people who visit us for Shabbat on a regular basis, know to always be on the lookout for divine intervention in their lives. You begin to ask yourself, what happened today that I would say is clearly God's hand in my life? Because I believe that it is Hashgacha Pratit, that is God's way of speaking our love language. It's His way of reminding us tangibly that He's here and He's active in our lives, that He loves us and that He only wants the best for us. Now, if we're always on the lookout for divine intervention, it's usually pretty easy to spot. Because the whole reason we do this exercise is to get us used to looking for all the good things that God does in our life. When we know someone's going to ask us, we keep our eyes open for these events and we begin to see that they actually happen quite often. But even that's not actually the end goal of this exercise. You see, the more often we see what I call fortuitous divine intervention in our lives, the more we become convinced that God really does care about us and wants the best for us. But that only leads us to understand the real goal of the exercise. So it's easy to see God in the good things, the things that have a happy ending, even if they didn't start out that way. But what about the bad things? You see, when you see all of the fortuitous divine providence that happens in your life, you know that God loves you and wants the best for you. Then, when something seemingly bad happens, you can know that there must be a good reason for that too. That this too is divine intervention. Now, no, I don't know if you noticed that, but I said seemingly bad, because when you're always looking out for divine intervention and you know that God is constantly intervening in your life for the good, then you can also know that when something bad happens, there is a reason for it that will ultimately be proven to be for your good too. Sometimes it takes a long time to see the end result, and sometimes we don't ever actually. But meanwhile, we have learned to trust because we have seen the pattern. And so even in the bad, we can trust that there's good and we can have peace, and it doesn't have to create a crisis of faith. Okay, so let's look at Mizmor Aleph. All right, I'm going to read just the English for you. The Hebrew is there on the screen, although part of it I think is covered up by the camera. But you, of course, are welcome to follow along in the Hebrew if you read Hebrew. And if you don't, well, then just follow along with us in the English here. And let's take a look at Mizmor Aleph. The praises of a man are that he did not follow the counsel of the wicked, neither did he stand in the way of sinners, nor in the seat of scorners. But his desire is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He shall be as a tree planted beside rivers of water, streams of water, which brings forth its fruit in its season, and its leaves do not wilt, and whatever he does prospers. Not so the wicked, but they are like the chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked shall not stand up in judgment, nor shall the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked shall perish. Like I said a few minutes ago, it's interesting to note that there appears to be a deliberate parallel constructed by King David between the Torah and the Psalms. It's if he's saying we're going to take it to the next level by moving the relationship with God from the head to the heart. Now, this is much clearer when we notice, as I mentioned before, that the phrase that begins this Mizmor, Ashrei Ha'ish, moves the last phrase of the Torah, Ashrecha Yisrael Michamocha, your praises Israel, who can compare to you, clearly from the national framework to Ashrei Ha'ish, the praises of man. The Yalkut is the commentary on that, by the way. And yet, the theme of this Mizmor is the preeminence of the Torah. While the Torah may have been given to the nation, it is the man that follows the law who is not only praiseworthy, but he is the one who will prosper. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, Penina. I know plenty of righteous people who do not seem to be prospering. I know plenty of righteous people whose life is very hard, who certainly don't seem like trees planted by a river. Heck, I feel like I'm withering right now. How many of you feel like you're wilting with the weather, huh? I am. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the psalm is incorrect. What it does mean is that our perception of prospering may not be accurate. We have to remember that we are finite, limited beings. We're only able to perceive good and bad based on whether something is pleasant or painful. But we don't always see what's going on outside our limited existence. Now, the word translated in verse 3 as prosper is the word yatzliach, which comes from the word hatzlacha, to have success. But the psalm doesn't open with the word hatzlacha. It opens with the word ashrei. The Malbim, which is one of our commentators, explains that the reason that David uses the word ashrei instead of hatzlacha is that hatzlacha means the successful achievement in the material and worldly realm, whereas the word osher, from which we get the word ashrei, applies to the spiritual attainment, whose rewards are not in this world, but in the world to come. So verse 1 is telling us that this person has a spiritual treasure. But for what? The praises of a man are that he did not walk in the counsel of the wicked, did not stand in the path of the sinful, and did not sit in the session of scorners. Wow, that's pretty tough if you think about it. It sounds like what he's saying is that what is praiseworthy and where you rack up your spiritual accomplishments or your spiritual success, so to speak, is in avoiding all people who sin, which is crazy because we all sin, so that's not possible. But our modern sensibilities tell us that we need to tolerate everyone, right? That we have to associate with all people, because if we refuse, we're not just exclusionists, but racists, holier than thou, self-righteous, judgmental, homophobes, you name it. The list could go on forever. Is it completely possible? Is it possible to completely remove ourselves from the company of sinners? But the bigger question, of course, is this what God wants from us? I would say no, and I'll show you why in a minute. These three words, or the three words used in the first verse, counsel, path, and session, right, that describe each of the groups, we're going to take a closer look at that, all right? The first one is counsel, all right? The word is atzat. And the Radak explains that the word atzat, counsel, applies to the convincing of the wicked. The old saying, misery loves company, it's true. And the wicked will always attempt to persuade others to join them in their pursuits. The more people join them, the more that they feel their behavior is acceptable. They create a new norm. Yeah, everybody's doing it. Join us. Come on. Rav Dessler warns against seeking the advice of the wicked, even in completely secular or worldly matters. He says that it is impossible for such a person to give advice that is not tainted with his own corrupted perspective. So this first one is not saying that you don't have anything to do with people who are wicked, because we have to live in this world and we have to associate with people who are, but that we should never follow their advice because it cannot be left untainted by their perspective, their worldview. All right? Number 2, in the path. That is the word baderech. Rav Hirsch points out that in the first phrase, the person is wicked, a rasha. This is a person who deliberately pushes others to lawlessness and a disregard for the Torah. But now the passage that we're talking about refers to walking in the path of a sinner. The choteh, or sinner, is someone who errs, E-R-R-S, errs unintentionally. The word chet means literally to miss the mark. The chatat, sin offering, was for a person who sinned unintentionally. Even though his sin is not a deliberate betrayal of Torah, his way is still to be avoided. Why? Why is David telling us stay away from somebody who sins unintentionally? You would think, hey, they're doing it by accident. They're not a wicked person. What's the problem? How does a person sin unintentionally? The only way to do so is not only to take God's law lightly, which, by the way, in the Torah and in the Tanakh, we are actually criticized specifically for doing that, but to live one's life on autopilot. That's not the way we were created. We cannot fulfill the calling we were created for, whether Jew or Gentile, if we are not living with intention. To live a life of purpose requires us to live with intention, to engage our brain. If we don't, one could ask, what's the point of our life? Every person who exists has value, a reason why they were created, and they cannot fulfill that purpose without intention. Don't be like this person, says King David. Don't follow his example. Turn on your brain, live with intention, and then you won't sin by accident. The third phrase is actually, instead of the phrase, we're actually going to look at the word scorners, right? Do not sit in the company of scorners. A scorner, or a lates, is related to the word malitz, which means an interpreter. The Ibn Ezra explains that just as an interpreter is transmitting a concept from one person to another, a lates, a scorner, also translated sometimes as a ridiculer, transmits the secrets of one man to another in order to shame him. This also involves a bit of arrogance. This is the sin of what we call in Hebrew lashon hara, evil speech or gossip. Another quality of the lates is that he looks down on others as his inferiors and therefore feels he has license to ridicule them. The Rambam, not the Ramban, but Maimonides, emphasizes that while the scorner commits no crime with their bodies, they accomplish terrible things with their tongues. It starts out with a harmless gathering of friends out for a good time, exchanging light talk, idle chatter, and then it descends into gossip, eventually deriding all that is good and holy. These we should not surround ourselves with. Why does it specifically say sit? Because sitting implies not casual contact with someone, but becoming comfortable with them, joining in their activity, settling down with them while they engage in it. So David's not telling us here that we can't have any contact with others who disagree with us or whose choices are different from ours, but rather that we should never take the advice or guidance, even the secular advice, of someone who hates God and his law. We should never follow the example of those who live without intention, because doing so always leads to sin. And lastly, we should never allow ourselves to enjoy or encourage gossip. Sometimes we can refocus a conversation, but more often than not, this last one does actually sometimes require us to physically remove ourselves from the situation. There are some people who just don't get it, and sometimes you just have to walk away to avoid entering into that mistake. So what is the psalm telling us? That a person who follows these three principles will have osher, spiritual benefits in the world to come. But it also tells us in verse 3 that the preventative for those is by regarding the Torah as a precious possession and thinking about it all the time. It says that he meditates on it day and night. Now, let's say you get a brand new car. This is one of our examples, our token boy example for our token boy who's in the room. But let's say you get a brand new car. It's exactly what you've always wanted. It's your dream car. For the first few days after you get it, it's pretty much all you think about. You hope no one damages it in the parking lot. You hope you remember to lock the doors so that nobody steals it or vandalizes it. You can't wait to get in it and drive home. Why? It's a precious possession, a chofetz, something highly desirable. When one regards the Torah as a precious possession and he thinks about it day and night, not only will he be able to avoid doing all the things listed in verses 1 and 2, giving him the osher, the spiritual reward, but it says in verse 3 that he will be like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in due season, and everything he does will succeed. We briefly touched on this a little while ago. The word for succeed is hatzlacha. That implies worldly success, but as we also mentioned, not all righteous people seem to enjoy worldly success. So what does it mean? Well, let's look at the whole verse. A tree that yields its fruit in due season. Does a tree bear fruit all the time? No, of course not. A tree only bears fruit for a small percentage of the year, right? Part of the year it remains dormant. In fact, during the winter, some trees look completely dead. When you look at a tree in the middle of winter, it's not always easy to tell if this is a tree that's going to produce fruit this year at all. After the dormant period, the tree first has to grow leaves and then bud, and then eventually it produces fruit, only to start the whole process over again. Many trees don't produce fruit at all for the first few years of their existence. So we have to stop looking with our eyes. Sometimes what does not look like it's producing fruit may simply not be producing fruit right now. But the promise is that one who regards the Torah as precious will not only bear spiritual fruit, but will also experience worldly success. Now, the interesting thing that I find, which parallels the whole idea that David is contrasting the end of the Torah with the beginning of Tehillim by taking us from the national focus, the Torah, the head, to the individual focus, the heart, okay, is the fact that he is taking the physical acts, not taking the advice of the wicked, not following the example of the unintentional, and not partaking in gossip, and saying that those physical things, they reap spiritual rewards. Whereas the spiritual pursuits regarding the Torah as a precious possession and keeping it at the top of our minds day and night, that, he seems to be saying, brings the physical worldly rewards. Perhaps the real message here is that they are both inextricably intertwined, and that what we do in the physical affects the spiritual, and what we do in the spiritual affects the physical, at least for the short time that we are here on earth. Both are bound together. But it is our job to actually bind the physical in the spiritual. That is the lesson of tzitzit, the fringes that observant Jewish men wear. Traditionally, the fringes, which are made up of 4 long strands folded in half, were 1 techelet, sky blue strand, and 3 right strands, or depending on how you count it, you could call it 8 and say 1 blue strand and 7 white strands. Today, many Jews do not use techelet, and there's a reason why, and I'm not going to get into it here, but those who do wrap the 3 white strands with a blue strand. Why does the blue strand get wrapped around the white strands? The white strands, there is symbology. There's symbology in everything Jewish, by the way. The white strands represent this world, this life, the natural, mundane existence that we have. And the blue strand, it's sky blue, to remind us of the heavens. It reminds us of the spiritual existence, which is reality. Everything we do in this life is to be bound, to be surrounded by and wrapped up in the spiritual. Together, this is the Torah. Together, these fringes remind us that there are physical commandments which we must keep, but which bring us a spiritual reward. Now, on to verses 4 through 6. Now, David is going to contrast the steadfastness of the righteous man by saying, "Not so the wicked. They are like the chaff which the wind drives away." The word here translated as chaff is the word motz, which comes from the word motzetz, which means to suck. Chaff is dry. All its nutrition has been removed. It has no value. When a person is wicked, their life has been drained, according to Rav Hirsch, of all meaning. A stalk of grain is made of 3 parts. The kernel, which is the staple of human nutrition. That's what we use to make bread. And some people take wheat berries, they're called, and just cook them and eat them like that. A lot of people put them in their cholent. Okay, that's 1, the kernel. That's the staple of human nutrition. 2 is straw, which is not only used for animals and animal feed and their bedding, but also in old times it was used for making mattresses and roofing houses. In fact, today in England, there are still houses with what they call thatched roofs. They're basically covered in hay. It actually makes a very effective stop to the weather, and it keeps the rain out. So the straw, or the hay, provides both comfort and protection for people. But the dry, thorny chaff, it's useless. Light and flimsy, the smallest gust of wind carries it away. According to Rav Dessler, the wicked are the same. The slightest change and they're left insecure because their trust, something that David will address later, it's not in the Torah or in God, but in their own schemes. The wicked are always working on a new scheme, something else, something bigger, something better. They're never settled, and they're always being tossed this way and that. Verse 5 goes on to say, "Therefore the wicked shall not stand up in judgment, nor shall the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. I find it interesting that the word translated here as stand up, or in some translated as be vindicated, is actually the word yakumu, which means to arise, or comes from the word to arise. So when the wicked stand before God on the day of judgment, they won't even be able to stand up in the judgment, because as we all know, in the time of the judgment, we're going to be faced with the reality of what we did with our lives. The sinners will not be in the company of the righteous, but they're not going to meet the same fate as the wicked, whereas the sinners will arise for judgment, but will have to go through a process in order to be able to join the righteous in heaven. The truly wicked won't even merit or survive that. Finally, David ends with this: "For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked shall perish." The implication here being that God is intimately involved in the life of the person who takes joy in the Torah, whereas the way of the wicked is left open to the whims of the world and ends with this life. The implication that the truly wicked, and we can't judge who's truly wicked, not really, although I'm sure that there are a few names that, there are a few names that I'm pretty sure make the list. They won't survive the judgment process and will be utterly destroyed, but their way is doomed. It ends here on earth. Now, we've run out of time for this week, but it's important to note before we end that the sages in Bracha 10a state that Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 are actually a unit. When a composition was particularly dear to David, apparently he opened it with the word Ashrei and he concluded it with the word Ashrei. Psalm 1 begins with Ashrei Ha'ish, and Psalm 2 ends with Ashrei Kol Chosebo. The Tosafot add that this rule not only applies to the word Ashrei, it applies to any psalm where the opening statement is similar to the closing one. So you may want to take a look at both psalms together, because together they form a unit, which we'll look at next week. If you got something out of this class, please pass it on to your friends. They can get all the registration information they need by going to PeninaTaylor.com and clicking on events and then walk through the Psalms. They can even Google it. And like I said, it's just not too late. They can join us. So thank you for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week as we walk through the Psalms.